everyone. My name is Terry Gardner, and I'm Director of Student Programs at the Faculty of Law. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our first webinar in the Jackman series, Building Knowledge. I am a settler here in Treaty 13 territory and a guest on these lands. And so it's important that I start by acknowledging that the land on which the University of Toronto operates is one that for thousands of years has been stewarded and held for those of us who would come later. It has been a place of holding very important knowledge and experience, and has been curated by many people who've come before us. The Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this place is still a meeting place and a gathering site, and particularly for us at the University of Toronto, a recognition of a site of learning, of building and sharing of knowledge. And I personally am so grateful for the many opportunities I've had. And I think back to sitting in a circle and an elder reaching over to share information with me of the principles that go with the two-row wampum and how that can be applied in every single engagement that I connect with. And so wanting to really invite that we pay attention to the many different knowledges that exist and expressing gratitude for the opportunity to learn and to work in this space. We know that it's not enough for lawyers to know the law and just to be zealous advocates. Lawyers in our contemporary world have a need to hold multiple knowledges in order to understand the people, the communities, the practices that are before them, and also to be rigorous, creative, adaptable, versatile, and innovative thinkers in crafting solutions and new approaches, and sometimes revisiting and holding long-held approaches. These are exactly the kinds of lawyers and leaders that the University of Toronto Faculty of Law is committed to educating. Today, we welcome U of T alumni and co-authors of the critically acclaimed nonfiction book, Valley of the Birdtail, An Indian Reserve, A White Town, and the Road to Reconciliation. This program contains 1 hour of EDI Professionalism Content from the Law Society of Ontario, and is an opportunity, we hope, for engaging in and furthering very important conversation towards building awareness and understanding. Andrew Stobo Sniderman is a writer, lawyer, and Rhodes Scholar from Montreal. He has written for the New York Times, the Globe and Mail, and Maclean's. He has also argued before the Supreme Court of Canada, served as the Human Rights Policy Advisor to the Canadian Minister of Foreign Affairs, and worked for a judge of South Africa's Constitutional Court. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you for having me.
And I'm very excited to work with Professor Douglas Sanderson, Amo Binashii, who is Beaver Clan of the Opakaswayak Cree Nation. From 2004 to 2007, he was a senior advisor to the Government of Ontario, first in the office of the Minister responsible for Aboriginal Affairs, and later to the Attorney General. He is a lawyer, Fulbright Scholar, and law professor at the University of Toronto Faculty of Law. Professor Sanderson's research areas include Aboriginal and Indigenous public and private legal theory. His current research interests include the peace and friendship treaties of 1600 to 1763 and the fur trade in Canada. Now, an invitation to everybody who has joined us, we really would like to make this discussion interactive. When we open the floor to questions, please raise your hand and to be unmuted, or you have the option of entering your question in the Q&A function, which you should see on your screen. Thank you so much, Andrew and Douglas, for joining us today. And I have already shared with you privately, but I am so enjoying and appreciating the challenging but important narratives that you are offering us in this story. And so I look forward and welcome to the conversation that you will lead us in today. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Terry. So thanks everyone for coming. It's so great to see so many of you in attendance today, and it's nice to be back in a classroom setting, albeit by Zoom again. So maybe I will just start by talking a little bit about what is obviously the most important thing in any topic, which is process. So Andrew Stobo was a student of mine about 10 years ago. We met then, and I knew he was working on a project. And he continued with the project. We continued to, we developed a friendship. And then eventually he approached me about co-authoring this book with him. I'll let Andrew pick up with where he, how he became interested in the topic first, but I just want to actually literally talk a little bit about process because it's actually, I find it fascinating. Andrew and I, Stobo and I, we have seen each other, we've been touring around in the book since September. And so we see each other every couple of weeks for a few days. But we never really spend any time together alone. We never actually get a chance to talk about the book when we're together. And we wrote the book together during the pandemic, each of us in different cities. I think Stobo was in Boston for part of it, in Florida. I was in my basement. And so this is a writing project. What we wanted to do in some sense is to really try and tell an honest account of history. And that meant in some ways having both of our voices come through. And the writing process really involved a lot of each of us reeling the other in a little more towards the middle. I mean, I think we're both pretty centrist, but there were times when, especially when we first got started, when Stobo would say, "Hey, listen, I really like what you did there, but white people got to get past chapter 2." So like, okay, let's reel that back, and maybe we've got savage too many times here. And so over a period of about 2 years, night after night, day after day, we went through the book word by word and sentence by sentence and rewrote it together. It was a really fascinating project because I had not really co-authored anything with anyone before. And you worry a little bit like, oh my God, but actually it turned out that it became very workmanlike. Very quickly, I could not tell whether I had written something or whether Andrew had written it. And then in the morning I'd get up, he'd point out things that he thought I could make better. I'd point out things he could make better. We'd give each other assignments for the day, and off we go. And the result is the text you see before you, if you have the book in front of you. When we handed it to our publisher, he said, "This is the best first draft I've ever read." At which point Stobo choked out. He said, "It's draft 137, which I think it was at least by then. So it's been written over and over, but I'm extremely proud of the work. I think it's, it's written, it is a work of nonfiction, but often when we're doing these talks, or if we have a moderator, they'll quickly start talking about the novel that we wrote. And I think that's because the characters in the story really move it along in a novelistic kind of way. And so that's actually about the book and how we got it written. But let Andrew tell you what it's really all about and how we got interested in it.
Thanks, Douglas. Hi, everyone. I wish we could see each other, but it's wonderful to be with you here today. And Douglas didn't quite say it, but I was his student. My very first class at U of T Law School was in his classroom. So that's how we first met. So I think maybe the way I'll start today is by explaining how I came to this project. And perhaps we can make it to, before we get to your comments and questions, perhaps one question I'm interested in talking about today is, what does the law have to do with this story? So I came to this as someone who knew next to nothing about Indigenous issues. And the thing that I noticed, or that I learned about while I was a law student, was the inequality affecting schools on reserve. And I found out about this because an amazing person named Cindy Blackstock was litigating this case, which had to do with unequal services on reserves. And her case was about child welfare services. And I found out because of this case that Indigenous students all across Canada living on reserves, and this is over 100,000 students, were going to schools that were dramatically, like 40 to 50% per student, underfunded compared to students in provincial public schools. And this, it struck me as so awful and wrong that I just couldn't believe that it was happening. That's how naive I was. And I also, as a law student, I couldn't really understand how that was legal. And so that was the issue that roped me into this larger story. And I thought to myself, well, if I can figure out a way to tell a really good story about this, maybe we can change the problem. And I became interested in these two communities, Wei-Wei-Si-Kapo, which is a reserve in Manitoba, about 4 hours west of Winnipeg, and a neighboring town called Rossburn. And the book is about the relationship between these communities and one family in each community. I became interested in these places because there were schools just a few kilometers away from each other. And there was a school on the reserve, and just down the road, there was a school in the town. And there was this dramatic gulf in the funding for these places and the outcomes, unsurprisingly, at these places. And I thought, well, I want to understand what it's like to go through that as someone living on the reserve, but I also want to understand the point of view of the town from a point of view of a non-Indigenous community. How do you make sense of that? Because it's so clear and stark that you'd think that it was hard to avoid the wrongness of it. And early on in the project, I reached out to Douglas, as he said, because it seemed clear to me that as a non-Indigenous person, I had clear limits and how well I could do this. And if we really want to reflect the point of view of an Indigenous family and a white family, it really made a lot of sense for us to work together. And by working together, the book became a lot more ambitious than just a story about this education inequality. It's become a much bigger story about how did inequality develop between these two communities over time, over the last 150 years, across many domains. And we think we've written the history of Canada in a way that will be new to you. Certainly it was new to me. And we think by following these two families and these two communities, we can understand a lot about what's gone wrong in Canada. And at the end, we propose a way forward. So I think I'll pause there. Douglas, is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, well, let me just say that the book is a history of Canada, and it does follow two families, one on reserve and one off reserve. And a lot of that history is actually it's dark. I'm gonna be honest. And that can be quite a challenge, both to write and to read. But Valley of the Birdtail is also, it's a very hopeful account in the end. In following these two families, we show how real people can change and grow and learn. And we put forward towards the end a series of fairly simple but we think extremely effective proposals, because what we want to do is we don't want to leave you sad or angry. We want to leave you hopeful, and we really think that this is a time when Canadians quite broadly are hungry for a conversation, hungry for action, and whether this is the right solution or not, it's a way to get talking about doing something much more ambitious on the Indigenous file than we've been doing. Poking one more program or increasing funding here or there, just it's never going to cut it. And so we put onto the table, what would substantive change, what would equality really look like in Canada? So I think I can leave it there.
Yeah, and I want to say one more thing about the process of writing the book, because first of all, I really hope you read it, to the people who are here. And I hope that you share it with your law firms and your organizations, and perhaps we can speak together about that afterwards. But the process of writing this book, we think, has written a book that often reads like a novel. We really want it to be a gripping read that doesn't, it shouldn't be like eating spinach. It really,
No lecturing.
that's right. We've tried to write a great story, and what that required was years of talking to people, a lot of it in person, some of it over the telephone, and years in archives to kind of uncover stories. It's a book of stories, and hopefully there is zero resemblance to a textbook whatsoever. So we really hope that it's a book that I hope you read it, and I suspect that if you crack it open, you will like it. So maybe here, before we go to Q&A, I thought maybe, Douglas, what we might do is say a little bit about the role of law in this story. And I might share a story about ceremony, the criminalization of ceremonies in Canada. And some of you may know, but as early as the 1880s and 1890s, Canada was passing criminal law to criminalize Indigenous ceremonies. The government saw it as dancing. Of course, it was much more than that. And the idea was this was part of a larger project to turn Indigenous people into white people and to criminalize their most central ceremonies was part of that process. But what I want to focus on today is the kind of bumbling effort of the government to do this. So there's a couple stories we unearthed of lawyers in the 1920s representing communities saying, yes, there's this awful criminal statute criminalizing types of dance, but actually, if you read this correctly, what we're doing now is perfectly legal, and these federal agents are still trying to shut down our dances. And there's a letter in which a lawyer says, hey, we welcome an Indian agent and a priest and an RCMP officer to come witness this ceremony. It is totally legal what's happening. And yet the government's trying to shut it down. There's this extraordinary work of lawyers trying to resist these totally outrageous laws that are being overread by the government in its enforcement. And we found the letters that the government people were writing to each other, in which they said, yeah, they're kind of right, but we still want to shut these dances down anyway. And what ends up happening is that in 1927, and there's a new law that's passed that makes it a lot more difficult for lawyers to represent Indigenous clients. And that's in place for 24 years. And in part, it makes it illegal for an Indigenous client to pay lawyers to represent them. And this is just one example, and I won't go into any details. Perhaps Douglas would like to talk about it. The past system, isn't it? Yeah.
Let me step in for just a second. Then,
Please.
So there's.
I think you just muted Douglas. Still muted, I think. You're still muted, but I'm sure what you're saying is brilliant. I still can't hear you. Still can't hear you. I might keep going with the example and then there you go.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. So sorry, I didn't know what happened there. So I was just saying that what Stobo was talking about there was an example of positive law where we're going to write a statute and we're going to make a thing illegal. Another sort of another interesting example, not using law at all, actually, was the pass system, which was introduced right after the rebellion around 1885, and effectively it turned every reservation in Canada into an open-air prison. You needed a written permission from an Indian agent in order to leave. You would be authorized to leave for a specific purpose, for a specific amount of time. Really just incredibly oppressive. And it turns out without any statutory authority whatsoever. And it turns out that this was just a policy that Indian agents were implementing all across the country at the behest of the Prime Minister's office, but with no legal authority to do so. And interestingly, it turns out, and we were never able to figure out who, but someone in the Solicitor General's office, in the RCMP, said, hey, we're not going to enforce this anymore. This is not legal. And so, lawyers play a role in the story. They're attempting to step up often for Indigenous people. They're pointing out where law is being either misapplied or where there is, in fact, no law to apply. And the answer, the government's answer is, of course, just to make it illegal to hire lawyers. So law comes in and out throughout the story, but law is ultimately not the villain here. The villain is really policies. It's the policies of governments that are enacted partly through laws, partly through regulations, partly just through policy, that sets the tone of the relationship and is the cause of the poverty and the inequality. Like one of the things that's clear by the time you finish Valley of the Birdtail is that none of this is an accident. These were all conscious policy choices made by governments, both liberal and conservative, for the past 150 years. So maybe we should just go to some questions. Is that
Yeah.
I think that's
and I should say, while people are piping in and asking their questions, there's a couple documents that we printed out in the book to kind of, for me at least, I had trouble believing. I had to see these things to believe them. And there's a page which has a pass actually printed out. If you have it in your hands, it's okay. If you don't, it's on page 126. And it's a permission a federal agent gave a father to leave a reserve to go visit his son at residential school, which is a horrific thing. And of course, was doing exactly what it was intended, which was restricting parents to see their children. And later on in the book, there's a permit, which we also print and it's the permit giving permission from a federal agent to someone living on reserve to sell a load of barley to someone off reserve. Because another manifestation of law in this story is a law that was passed in the late 19th century to make it illegal to sell anything that's grown or raised on a reserve off reserve without the permission of a federal agent. And you will not be surprised to know that this devastated reserve economies. And it just so happened that someone we spoke to, had an old permit from 1947 that his father had kept because they had always thought it was so outrageous. And the last little thing I'll mention about that is that this program was so outrageous that a local newspaper in a small rural non-Indigenous community in the 1890s, I think it was, printed an editorial, and they said this permit system restricting the sale of basic agricultural goods on reserve is outrageous. It's wrong. Their wheat is just as good as ours, and it's so wrong that people are going to rebel. And of course, nothing changed, but one of the great joys of working on a book like this and looking at the history is you realize that not everyone was okay with what was happening. And Douglas, I think, gave another good example of, that person in the Solicitor General's office. And the closer you look.
I want to point out, too, that the statute that prohibited the sale of produce to non-Indians was repealed in 2014.
Yeah.
So it had a long, long life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So, Douglas, I'm going to give you the very unenviable task. I see a question from Philip Anisman, and he's asking us to summarize our recommendations. And maybe you want to take a swing at that. That's a tough task. It's a wonderful chapter 18, 6,000 words.
So, how do you fix everything? Well, so let me try it this way. Valley started as a comprehensive look at education policy. And, how is it that we could underfund kids for so long? How did that happen? How did it keep happening? And so we're able to show you how that happened. But right alongside that education issue is the Cindy Blackstock child welfare situation. Right? And, alongside that is the lack of potable water on many reserves. And, alongside that is increased or overrepresentation in prisons. So there's all of these problems. And it occurred to us in thinking about, what a future might look like, that there's one way to solve all of these problems at once. And that's to provide Indigenous people with the governing authority to have power over their lands so that they can use those lands to raise revenue, and then they can spend that money in their communities. Because that's what governments do everywhere, right? Like that's effectively what a government is an organization that taxes people and things and then spends that money on its citizens. And so we think an Indigenous order of government would never allow their children to receive unequal funding. We know that if Indigenous governments were empowered to raise and spend money, they would fix their clean water. They would have clean drinking water. They would, the child welfare system would be a well-functioning one. So the answer is governance. Indigenous people have to be governing of themselves and making those decisions. But that's, of course, going to come at, how do you do that? Well, what we want to draw on as much as we can are very familiar things. And so we've been making comprehensive land claims for about 30 years now. And what a comprehensive land claim really is it's an assertion of jurisdiction over a large territory, the ability to tax resources within that area, and then a series of governmental powers that would authorize you to say, regulate timber or, spend money on schools or whatever. So, that's a mechanism that we kind of know about, right? That we have done before many, many times. And I think the last piece of that is that we recognize that, any transfer of lands and jurisdiction to Indigenous people is going to come at a cost. And, I think we Indigenous scholars maybe have a long time just like pretended that there was no costs involved and, are surprised when people don't want to meet all of our demands. So the way we propose to ameliorate that is through using the familiar mechanism of the equalization formula, just a way for Indigenous nations, the ones that are doing well with the resources, to pay into a system, and then poorer First Nations to be recipients, just like Prince Edward Island, right? Like the equalization in the Constitution, it's a commitment to a standard level of services all across the country. Everyone in Canada has equal access to education and healthcare, except on reserves. So we just propose to bring Indigenous peoples, First Nations, into Confederation through this equalization formula, making them citizens just like everyone else, entitled to all the same services. So I think that's like kind of the basic outline, transferring jurisdiction over areas, power to tax, a way to redistribute the funds. If that's,
Thanks, Douglas.
yeah, sorry.
No, thank you. And I hope that was satisfactory. And I just wanted to draw attention to Clarissa Brocklehurst's comment. She's, I think we can all see it, but I think she was talking about water in Wew'suwet'en and on reserves. And it's not something we focused on, but I think I recall a water truck is still driving around the community and bringing around the potable water, which of course is not a terrific system. And as Douglas was saying, access to drinking water is just one dimension of unequal services on reserves. And I think there was a striking moment for me, at least, to get to what Douglas was just saying, when I realized, oh, reserves are just excluded from equalization. And there's this principle that holds true almost everywhere in Canada, which is people are going to get comparable services wherever you are. And if you're in PEI, even though it's not a particularly wealthy place, or in Nunavut or in the Yukon, there's a statute or a constitutional text that says you're going to get a transfer to bring yourself up to comparable services. And reserves are just a black hole when it comes to this. And I think that's part of the reason, the legal story, although not the entire part of it, which leads us to this place where there were dramatically worse services for hundreds of thousands of Canadians. And that wasn't somehow a legal constitutional problem for a long, long time.
So I see a question from Val Liskey about the Crown, and that's what role does the Crown play? And I think, so I've written very recently, briefly about this in the Globe and Mail, and that's just to say that the Crown, like in terms of the Commonwealth Crown, like the King, I guess now, plays like literally no role. And, you know, and in fact, actually hoping that, you know, some foreign power might somehow intervene on behalf of Indigenous Canadians is, you know, it strikes me as like, you know, not just wishful thinking, but like not even really placing the problem like right at the feet of the right players. Like when the Constitution was repatriated, Canada assumed all of the duties of the Crown. And so the relationship between Indigenous people is not with the King of England, it's with the Crown in whatever entity that is. Sometimes that's the big Crown, the federal government, sometimes it's a little Crown, the provincial governments, but that's the seat of the relationship. And that's the relationship that needs to be fixed. And I'm sure the King would be very happy to see us do it, but I don't think that there's any, in fact, we actually tried to litigate this back in 1981. And in fact, Denning, of all people, heard the case and said, you know, this is not the right forum. All of the duties of this Crown devolved to the Canadian government when the Constitution was repatriated. So that's I think that's the best I can do on the question of the Crown. Let me see.
There was I just want to say there was a quick comment from Norman Slotkin, forgive me for that pronunciation, to the effect of there was a great documentary by Alex Williams about the pass system. I agree, it's great. And we tried to dig even deeper into the pass system and to figure out where it came from. And one of the astonishing things about this system, as Douglas was saying, was that there was never actually a statute authorizing it. And it's actually worse than that, because when it was proposed and supported by the Prime Minister, in their private letters, there's an acknowledgement that it's totally illegal, because the terms of treaties as they were written, of course, let people leave reserve. And the government, their answer was, well, it's best for these people. We'll do what's best for them. And we're going to do our best to keep it from them that it's totally illegal. And there's this astonishing letter, I think, which is referred to in the documentary that Alex Williams did from the 1940s, which is about 60 years after the pass system is implemented, which goes out to all the federal Indian agents across Canada and says, oh, by the way, you can burn all your pass booklets, because it turns out it's illegal and we shouldn't be doing it anymore. So if you're still using them, which if people were, maybe just get rid of them and let's not talk about it anymore. And it's a really awful moment where on its face, it was always illegal. The RCMP realized it was illegal at one point. They stopped enforcing it, but the Department of Indian Affairs kept doing it. And it's a very dark moment for the law just being flagrantly violated. And of course, there's another dimension of the story is when the law authorizes bad things. But in this case, the government was just going above and beyond and behaving completely illegally the entire time.
So I'm going to get to Jack, your question in just a second. I just want to say something more about the pass system, which is that the origins of the pass system, it's implemented immediately after the Real Rebellion. So it's really initially it's about, whoa, those Indians, they might rebel. And then it just became convenient. Right, like there was, even when it was clear there was going to be no rebellion, it's shocking how quickly, policy can change with circumstances without any actions changing at all. So Jack is wondering, would a government over Indigenous lands be like a provincial government under the Canadian Constitution? Well, I think Jack will like a provincial government, but I think, again, the proper model for us, the appropriate model, are the existing comprehensive land claim treaties. So if we look at something like the Nisga'a Agreement, we didn't need any kind of constitutional, we didn't need a constitutional do-over. Instead, the province of British Columbia and the federal government simply each passed statutes. And what they did was they provided, like the Nisga'a Nation's gonna, be in charge of forestry, which is normally a provincial responsibility. The province transfers that jurisdiction to the Nisga'a. The Nisga'a also are going to have a fishery, which is federal, and so federal powers are authorized to the Nisga'a. And so Indian governments won't be like provinces in that they won't have the exact set of powers set out in 92. Instead, there'll be a mix of the powers that Indigenous people need in order to operate over the lands that they are in possession and control of. So kind of like a province in that it's an order of government, but with a different set of authorities than the provinces necessarily have. I hope that's helpful. Do I have any confidence that the government will stop taking Indigenous people to court? No, I think courts in the, I mean, there's a way in which, the access of courts to resolve our disputes is sort of, there's a way in which it can be normal. I mean, it's clear that in many ways, the government has been using courts as a way of stalling, as a way of trying avoiding. I think back to, as I said at the top, I've become interested in sort of the period before 1763. And there we actually get to see Indians accessing the common law courts because of land deals gone wrong, right? And so, like, people accessing courts, governments using courts to resolve problems is, I think, a normal part of a functioning liberal democracy. It's certainly true that successive federal governments have gone out of their way to try and sue their way out of these problems, or sue their way out of paying for these problems. And I'm not sure that, let me put it this way. We're trying to solve a lot of problems using the common law and courts, and these aren't really legal problems, right? That's an avenue of approach for them, but these are political problems. These are questions about the distribution of resources and wealth. And so the proper forum for that, I think, is actually, in a public forum where we could debate and resolve issues, instead of always resorting to the courts.
Can I add, Barb? Thanks for reaching out. And I just want to say on a personal level that Cindy Blackstock was the person that inspired me to get interested in these issues. And I, in part, always saw this book as a kind of complement to the legal arguments that were being made. And as Douglas is suggesting, we think that the courts can only do so much, and a lot of this is a political problem. And we hope this book can be a tool to complement those amazing legal efforts that Cindy Blackstock is still leading. And I'm curious what you make of it, and I hope you feel free to let us know if you think we've done that well. And I want to get to what Shelley Peterson has asked, and she said, can you explain how your solutions might lead to changing the racist attitudes on both sides of the bird tail? And if I miss something, Douglas, please complete the answer. But I think one of the important things we're trying to do in this book, as I see it, is to sit down with people in this very conservative town and hear them out and try to understand what's their point of view and how do they see unequal services on reserves. And you may not be surprised to hear that they don't see themselves as horrible racists or horrible people, though some of them may in fact be. I think one of the achievements of the book, as Douglas has said in the past, is that we get racists to be racist. And so we get people to be open about what they're thinking, but that's a pretty harsh way to put it. And I think another way to put it is to say, we're trying to articulate the worldview of people who have normalized the unequal services on reserves. And we think that's important to do because that's part of what we need to overcome. We need to learn to talk to people like that and to persuade them to be part of the solution. And, I think what makes me hopeful in part is that the book shows that people are capable of changing, and there's an avowed racist whose thinking changes because of what he learns and because of contact he has with Indigenous people. So
actually, I think he's still at the end, he still calls himself a racist. He says, I think I might still be a racist, because he's now aware that he harbors views that are racist, and that he's not even sure, and I don't think any of us can be entirely sure, that all of the views we have are not racist, right? So he's actually learned not just that, he's learned what it is to have racist views, not just to be a racist. And I think that's a remarkable admission from him. And the guy's old too, right? It's very late in his life. How old is Nelson?
70s. He's in his 70s.
Yeah. So.
And if I can just finally try to articulate part of what I'm trying to say, Shelley, which is that I think it's a mistake to kind of write off people from places like Rossburn as racists that we're not really interested in. And I think they can be and often are part of the solution. And if we could maybe listen a bit more carefully, we can see where they're coming from. And it's possible over time to build common ground. And in the case of schools on reserves, everyone agrees that it makes sense to give people a decent education. And so that's one of the building blocks we use in this story. And I know people can change their attitudes, and it's not just going to be laws. In part, it's going to be us talking to each other and trying to learn from each other. But of course, law can coerce people when they're not on board in the present.
Sorry, I'm just plugging in my Ethernet
no problem
cable here. Yeah, sorry.
So I'm going to dodge Jack's really tough question about the Indian Act for a moment. Perhaps Douglas wants to. And I agree, Pam, 70s, not old at all. My father's in his 80s, and he is a totally unstoppable force. So shame on you, Douglas.
And what a future is that the question?
I think that's, go ahead.
I think I'll just say this is that I think that, this question of Indigenous and settler relations is so complicated and it has so many different facets that, we tend to try and simplify things in our brains. And so there's there's the Indian Act. And if we just get rid of that, then something. But I know it's not a book. It's just a statute, right? It's not magical or powerful. It's just a statute. We can change it anytime we want. We can get rid of it. I think that for sure it is the case that, no matter what, if Indigenous people are going to have a relationship with the Crown, it's going to have to be regulated in some way, and there'll be a statute for that. People say, well, what about treaty nations, and even if you sign a treaty with an Indigenous nation, and you still have to have domestic laws to implement that treaty, and so there's still going to be statutory acts. So I maybe want to just move away from the idea that there's this bugbear called the Indian Act, and that's the problem. It's not the problem, right? There's many, many, many problems, and that's just a lone statute, which on its own doesn't, it has considerable effect in the world, but it's not really the source of all of the problems.
Thanks, Douglas. And do you want to take a stab at this next question, which is about how 600 plus First Nations can take advantage of the arrangements that were, that come up in Chapter 18, given
Right.
that there's all these separate communities? Yeah.
Yeah. So this is a politics question, not a law question, but so again, like I think that we're all guilty of being trapped in our choice of words. And so, like on my side, right, we've insisted you call us nations, right? We're First Nations. I come from the Opaskwayak Cree Nation. But there's like 1,200 of us, right? We are not really a nation, and we're never going to be one. We're never going to mint our own currency. We're never going to have a seat at the United Nations. And so by insisting on calling us nations, we set out expectations, both I think from the settler side, but also from within, about what it is we're talking about when we're talking about this relationship. And so I think that there certainly are First Nations and Indigenous nations, but to be viable as governments, you need to be a certain size. And so what we suggest actually in the text is that like a model for doing this is the 43 communities in Northern Ontario. Like they're all tiny. No one of them can have the manpower to make effective resource extraction decisions, right? Like, where are we going to put a mine? Like, that's a complicated question. You need more than 300 people in your community to be able to answer that question. So we're proposing that communities need to find ways to come together, right? To form larger confederacies, probably speaking the same language. And these organizations kind of exist already. Within Ontario, there were 5 political territorial organizations. Each of them consists of 40 or so First Nations. So, there are already, versions of the right size government in place. I think we need to acknowledge that that these things are going to, big decisions require a big scale. And so if it will become incumbent upon First Nations to work together to be able to to form into bodies that are capable of organizing around complex economic and social decisions.
Just while we're waiting for more questions, which I hope we come in, I think it's, what this discussion has done is gravitated towards the policy and legal questions, which is great. And I just want to reemphasize for those of you who have not read the book, that it's a highly character-driven story in order to get people into these issues without making it read like a textbook. And it's at the very end.
Why don't you tell them about some of the characters? So why don't you start with Maureen? Talk about Maureen.
Well, Clara, I'll answer your question at the same time. So that's quite deep into it, Clara. I'm glad you're on chapter 14. She's asking about the process of working with and interviewing the 2 families. So let me tell you about Maureen. Maureen she's a young woman who's an educator on this reserve. And I met her now 5 years ago. And on my very first trip to Wew'suwet'en, I went to the school on the reserve and I just really started hanging out. And at the invitation of the chief and council and the principal of the school, and I met Maureen. And, when you're the nature of this book, it's so intimate. As people who've started reading it know, people have really opened up their lives to us. And
people
Maureen is
this. Say it.
Yeah, that's right. And she is this amazing young person who goes through a very unequal education system on the reserve. And she is extraordinary in part because she makes it through and she's gone on to get lots of higher education in more ways than one, not just a literal one. And she's a model. She's become a model for young people in her community, and she's devoted herself to being an educator in the community. But I think what's even more extraordinary about Maureen, it's not that she beat the odds, which she did. It's how acutely aware she is of all the people who didn't. And as a young student, she makes these devastating observations about, being on the school bus every year, grade 9, grade 10, grade 11, grade 12, and every year there's fewer people on the bus coming from the reserve. to the school in the town. And she doesn't see herself as a hero. She sees herself as lucky. And the last thing I'll say, Clara, about the process, like with any good interviewing process, at the beginning, you explain, here's what this book is about. Like, here's the project. And might you want to be a part of this? And everyone got the option to be anonymous. No one took it, which I think is a testament to the text and their commitment to the text. And the conversations took years, of earning everyone's trust and doing the story right. It took years of talking with people. And in the case of this book, we showed every character, every major character, the draft text of the book, which is a very terrifying moment because you're concerned that people will just tear it up and say they want nothing to do with it. And amazingly, people said, we're thrilled to be a part of this. And maybe you could just add a few things, but no, there were no significant removals. And people chose, as I said, to use their real names. And as far as I know, in my last conversation with Maureen, her feedback is that people are reading it in Wew'suwet'en and in Rossburn, and in her community, people are coming up to her and her mom, Linda, who's also an extraordinary character in the book, and saying, you were so brave, and can I give you a hug? And thank you for sharing your story, which is a really amazing, affirming thing for us, and I hope it is for them.
Yeah, so I will let me talk about another character in the book, because for those of you who have not read the book, the book centers around two families, and so we spend a lot of time with those living people, but we also spend a lot of time with dead people. We look back to historical actors, and one of the most fascinating stories and characters is a guy named Clifford Sifton, and he is the Minister of the Interior at the early part of the 20th century. And so he's just, he's the Minister of the Interior, so he's in charge of Indians, and he's just, signed a bunch of treaties and moved Indians into reserves, and now they've got all this land that they need to populate. So Sifton sets out to populate the prairies, specifically with Ukrainian immigrants. Now, since the war started, we've all heard that, oh, there's so many Ukrainians here in Canada. Well, there's a reason for that. It's because we went and we got them, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian peasants who were being oppressed by the Russians at the time. We brought them to Canada. We set them up in the prairies, and they faced just abject racism when they got here. People didn't think they were white enough to be Canadians. They thought they were dirty. I mean, they were really, really awful. And then when World War I came, we actually interred a bunch of the Ukrainians because Ukraine at that time was allied with like the Prussians or something. Anyway, so Sifton is doing this, but again, he's protecting these Ukrainian immigrants. He's promoting their language. He's encouraging them to continue to learn their traditions and cultures. And at the very same time, as Minister of the Interior, he's introduced the pass system. He is suppressing dance and culture of Indigenous peoples. He is, he's both everything we want Canadians to be, generous, open, welcoming, and also everything we don't want them to be, oppressive. And there's a way in which, he's an older character, he's from the past, but, if you look at our immigration system today, it's not fair, right? We still, now we're favoring Ukrainians again, because they're fleeing oppression, but Ethiopians and Eritreans are oppressed, and they don't get the special programming. So there's a way in which these characters, all of them, are in some way old sort of 19th century characters, but they're also, they're also an instantiation of a very modern version of us as Canadians. So I think you'll find that the book unfolds through the stories of real people, historical actors for, much of it, until we can get to the people who are alive today. And maybe do you want to talk a little bit about like Hayter Reed, maybe, because he's so awesome?
Yeah, and we've got two impossibly difficult questions from Michael and Jack. But I would be happy always to talk about Hayter Reed. I should say to everyone, we're going to run out of time in a few minutes. Please feel free to write us. We're happy to be in touch. And Douglas, I don't know if you want to take a stab at these. These are tough.
I'll have a look at Jack's question maybe. Jack is, congratulations, Jack! Yay! You're an Indian now, yay! And actually, I've been telling Stobo about this time when I was, my mother was a status Indian. She married my father, who was a non-status Indian. So my mother lost her status, and so my sister and I were born as non-status Indians. But then in the 80s, my mother was reinstated as an Indian, and my sister and I magically became Indians. And so I was left with exactly the same question you have, Jack. Like, what the hell does this mean? What does it mean to be an Indian? And so I actually wrote the Department of Indian Affairs as a kid and said, hey, it turns out I'm an Indian. What does that actually mean? And what they did was they just put a copy of the Indian Act in an envelope and mailed it back to me. I mean, what else were they going to do, I suppose? But and so, Jack, welcome to the club. But you've been an Indian this whole time, right? Like, my mother will say that when she lost her status, in a way, she just didn't care because it was never who she was, right? She was Indigenous because of her family and because of her language. And so, Jack, find your people, learn some language. It's and also, like, I want to imagine a world in the future where being Indigenous and having access to Indigenous communities is something that we can all do, right? Like, just like I don't have to be an Indian, right? I can quit anytime I want and just be cab driver in Sudbury and pretend I'm Iranian or something. I think it should be open in the future to non-Indigenous people who look around and think, I hate this life. I don't want to do it anymore. But I really like the way the James Bay Cree are living. Maybe like move there, marry, get adopted into a clan, learn the language, right? And become a member of that community. I think that is that sort of ability for us to live a variety of full, meaningful lives as Canadians is the world that I want us to see in the future. And that's not ever going to be about who has a card and who doesn't have a card. It's about who has a community. And so, Jack, I would encourage you to find people and make friends and learn some culture, learn some language. And people often wonder, like, how do I do that? And the answer is simple. Elders teach by doing. So, it sounds silly, but enroll in a course. My wife and daughter took a course on moccasin making, and that forces you to confront technologies you've never thought about before and to bend your mind to ways of being, ways of thinking about materiality that you've never done before. It confronts your limitations when you're doing new things. So, find a language course, find a beading course, find a moccasin making course. I just discovered that in Ontario, it's actually possible to become a licensed professional trapper. So I'm going to take a course. I'm going to do that. But I think that's the answer, Jack, is you find community, and that's what it really has to be all about.
Can I briefly mention two things? Ron, good question. I'm glad I'm not the person answering that question. And neither, hopefully both of us don't have to answer that question. But Michael Woods, I want to point you to I think a big drama in the book, if not Canadian history, is Pierre Trudeau's part in this story. We don't focus that much on it, but I think, as some of you will remember, when he came to power in 1968, he had a very individual rights frame and pushed a thing called the White Paper, whose purpose in part was to get rid of distinct status for anyone and to get rid of reserves and so on and so forth. And it didn't work. And it's part of this larger drama of Canada, which is trying to balance collective and individual rights. And I, being from Quebec, am part of another part of this story. And I don't have a complete answer for you today, certainly, but I think that tension is part of this story that we're telling, and it's certainly part of some of the difficult moments that took place in the 60s and the 70s.
Yeah, I'll just say that I think that the reason that the question is so hard is because it's both not a question, really. I mean, I'm not even really sure what those words actually mean, and I don't mean to be facetious here, but like I have trouble discerning individual from collective rights at times, and I think that that's a language and a categorization uh, which is useful to us at times, but I think at other times it just muddies the debate. And really, in a way, we're not talking about rights here, right? We're talking about what it is to be Canadian, what it is for Indigenous people to live good, meaningful lives as Indigenous people. And is that their right or not? Is it their collective right? I don't know. But that's what I want to see is Indigenous people living good lives, and whether that's through the exercise of individual or collective rights, I'm a little agnostic on. I'm more interested in how we get to the result than trying to choose which label I want to apply to it.
It's totally amazing. There's still 80 of us here together. I'm thrilled that we were able to be together. And yes. And I hope people will pick up a copy online or in their local bookstore, and please feel free to reach out to us and share your feedback or thoughts.
I just want to plug to also the audiobook for those of you who are like, I don't have time to read a book. The audiobook's amazing. It's really, really, the voice actor who did it is really, really good. And I bought it myself because, you know, if you write, like writing a book's like writing a paper, you got to read it 1,000 times. And I was so sick of reading it by the time I got on the plane to start the book tour that having the audiobook was a godsend. And I just want to encourage you to consider it if you're not sure you have time to read a book.